all the values get set to their defaults. I'm going to call this Invader. Actually, I'm going to call this Invader Base, and I'll explain why in a minute. And let's add a couple components we're going to need. So one's a sprite renderer. And we're also going to want to add our box glider 2D. Now, in this case, we don't have a sprite yet because there's multiple sprites for us to choose from. And we're going to utilize something called prefab variants that allow us to set a different sprite but keep the rest of the properties and components the same. So, given this game object here, we can create our base prefab. So let me create a new folder called prefab. Fabs. And all we need to do to create a prefab is drag this into our folder down here. So now we have a prefab called Invader Base. A prefab is a custom type of asset that we can reutilize throughout our entire project. It'll also allow us to instantiate new instances of this game object through our script later on. So that's just our base prefab, but we want to create a variant of this that has a specific invader sprite attached to it, as well as the size of our collider and so on. So for example, maybe by default, this is just 1, but this will get overridden based on the sprite that gets set. So let's say here we want to assign our specific invader this time. So let's say invader 1, we can drag that into our sprite there. We can see it show up in the scene. And let's reset our box collider 2D so the size gets updated. In this case, the size actually was fine, but for some of our other sprites, the size will be slightly different. So now that we've made a couple changes here, we can revert that. You can see on the left here, anytime you make a change to something, you'll see a little blue to indicate that property has been changed compared to what the prefab is currently set to. So all that's been changed on this particular object is our sprite here. Now, if we drag this again into our project, our project folder, we can create a different prefab that's a variant of the base. Let me first rename this. I'm going to call this one Invader 1. So I'll drag this in, and it's going to ask us, would you like to create a new original prefab or a variant of the prefab that I'm already using? And we're going to create a variant. And so now we have Invader 01 variant. I'm just going to get rid of the variant there and just have Invader 01. And notice how we can actually see the sprite show up there too. Let's do this again. Now this time, let's delete that. Let's start with our base once again. And let's assign a different sprite here. So let's assign number 2. And let's reset our box collider to see if the size changed. So yeah, in this case, the size actually did change. Let's revert our trigger. We want to keep that how it was. but our size and our sprite are the differences in this particular game object. So let's do this once again. Let's drag this into our project folder. Let's create a prefab variant. I forgot to rename it, but that's okay. We can rename it right here. So I'll just call this Invader 2. It's going to actually rename the game object for us as well. And one final time, let's do this for our third one. And so we start with our base. So I drag that into our scene. And now I'm going to assign the correct sprite. So let's get the third one here. And you might be wondering why there is actually 6 different sprites. Later on, we're going to animate these invaders. So there's really 2 different sprites per invader. So for now, I'm just selecting the first one for each. So Invader 3, let's reset our box collider so the size gets automatically updated to fit that particular sprite. Let's revert our is trigger so that stays the same. And once again, you can see the only changes on this object are our sprite and our size. And we can drag this in one final time, create a prefab variant. Let's name this one Invader 03. So now we have our different invaders, which later on we can write a script to lay them out in a grid. I'm going to get rid of the base there from our scene. And at any point, I could drag in different invaders into my scene, or if we want to write a script to do it, we can do that as well. Let's write our first script to animate our invader sprites. So let's go ahead and first create a new folder to contain all of our scripts. Let's go ahead and open that up, right click, create C# script, and I'm just going to call this Invader. Let's open this up. And Unity by default provides a class that inherits from mono behavior. There's also going to be a couple of functions that are just very commonly used. But I actually like to kind of just delete everything and start from scratch. It's just my preference. So to animate our invader sprites, we're going to need to keep track of an array of sprites that we want to cycle between. And so let's create a variable for that. I'm just going to call this animation sprites. So this is an array of sprites. It's public, so we can actually change it in the editor, which we'll be able to see in a minute. We're also going to want a variable for the animation time, which is essentially how often does it cycle to the next sprite. And then we're going to need a reference to our sprite renderer so we can actually change which sprite is currently being rendered. So let's just call it sprite renderer. And we also need one other variable to keep track of which, sprite we're currently using, which is just going to be an index within our array. So this will be an integer. And we'll just call this animation frame. Okay, so now first, let's establish our reference here to our sprite renderer. So we'll do this inside our awake function, which will be the very first function that gets called for the life cycle of this script. And Unity will call this for us automatically. And so we can assign our sprite renderer by saying get component. And then we specify the type of component we want to get, and that's it. And so what this is going to do is it's going to look on the same game object that our invader script is attached to. It's going to look for the component that we specified, which in this case is sprite renderer. And when our script starts executing, so the start gets called the very first frame this script is enabled on an active game object. And so on that very first frame, we want to start our animation loop, basically. And we can do something called invoke repeating. So invoke is allowing us to invoke a method after some amount of seconds. And then repeating is that it's going to repeat that over and over and over again. So we need to provide a method to actually invoke. So let's actually create that first. And I'm just going to call this animate sprite. And so in our invoke repeating, we can reference that method here. And then we need to provide how often it's going to repeat this. And there's the initial time, like the initial first time this gets called, like how many seconds. And then from that point on, how many seconds every time after. And we're just going to use our single variable animation time for both of those. Okay, so once again, basically what this is going to do is it's going to call our animate sprite every, X amount of seconds, whatever is provided here. And let's say by default, this has a time of 1 second. We can change this in the editor because we've marked it as public, but 1 second should be pretty sufficient. So within here, anytime we say animated sprite, we're basically going to update which frame we're on. So we're going to say animation frame plus plus to increment it to the next one. And then we need to check to make sure that our current frame does not exceed however many sprites we actually have provided. If you're exceeding how many sprites you've provided, well, then we should loop back to the very beginning again. We can say if animation frame is greater than or equal to however many sprites we have, so dot length, well then we will simply set that back. Oops, let me fix that. We will simply set that back to 0 to start over again. And then from here, all we need to do is update which sprite we're rendering. So we say sprite render.sprite equals animation sprites, and then we're going to get the element at the index here, which is our animation frame. And that should be it for that should be frame. And that should be it for animating our invaders. Let's go ahead and add our script to our invader prefabs here. And really all we need to do is add it to the base prefab, and it will automatically add that to the variants that we've created. So I have my base prefab selected. Let's drag our script into the empty space there. Here you can see by default, there's 0 sprites being provided. Our animation time is 1. And now we can set the individual sprites on each of these variants. And notice once again, I only added the script to our base prefab, but because we created these as variants of the base prefab, these other prefabs also get that script. And so for each one of these, let's go ahead and assign our 2 sprites. Let's do for this one, we're going to do 1 and 2. If you are using the same sprites as me, once again, they're all available to download for free in GitHub with the rest of the project as well. If you're using your own sprites, then feel free to assign these. And you can have more than 2. You can have as many as you want, really. And then finally, our third one here. Oops. 2. Okay, that should be good. Let me double check. Yep, looks good. Okay, and just for the sake of testing this out, let me bring all of these into our scene here. Let me just spread them out so I can see them all. Let's go ahead and play our game real quick. and we should see these updating. Yep, so every second you can see the sprite kind of change to the next one, and then it starts over again. And there we go. So that's it. That's all we need to do for animating our sprites. Now that we've set up and animated our sprites, there we go. So that's it. That's all we need to do for animating our sprites. Now that we've set up and animated our individual invaders, let's finally form our grid of invaders. So first, let's create a new script, and I'm going to just call this invaders, plural. And let's also create a game object to go along with that. So this will be an empty game object. We'll call it invaders. Let's reset the transform so it's at the origin, which is the middle of our screen. Let's add our script to that game object. So this game object will act as a parent, which all the individual invaders will be attached to. Let's go ahead and edit our script here. And let's add a couple variables. So we're forming a grid, and a grid you can think of as rows and columns. So let's have two variables, rows and columns. So this is the number of rows and the number of columns. By default, Space Invaders has 5 rows and 11 columns, but feel free to set those to be whatever you'd want. We're making these public variables so we can change them in the editor if we want to. And we also want to have an array of prefabs that will correspond to each row within our grid. So each row instantiates a different prefab. So we can set up an array of invaders here, and we'll call this prefabs. And then finally, in our awake function, we can perform all of the actual logic. So let's start by just creating our 2D for loop, or our nested for loop to loop over each row and column. So we can say something like for int row equals 0. So start at 0. Row is less than however many rows we have, and then row will get incremented. Then same exact thing for columns. We'll say COL equals 0. Column is less than however many columns we have, and column plus plus. So pretty standard for loops there. And within here, we can basically just instantiate each one of our invaders. And then we need to provide a prefab that we want to clone from. So the prefab will just be whatever row we're currently in. So once again, this array of prefabs corresponds to each of the rows. So we can just say row. And then we can provide a second argument here, which is going to be the transform we want to parent this invader to, which is this transform, our invaders as a whole. And that's it. And we can even store the result of this into a variable here. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this does. There's definitely more we still need to do, but let's run this. Only first, we need to assign our prefabs here. So let's set the size to be 5 because there's 5 rows. Let's go ahead and drag in our different prefabs to these spots. And so element 0 will actually be the bottom row, and the last element will be the top row. Normally there's 2 of these at the bottom, and there's 2 of this middle one, and then the top row just has one row of those. Okay, let's run that one more time. So we can see all of our invaders here are stacked on top of each other. That's because we haven't yet set their positions, but you can see all of the invaders being cloned here. Even have the word clone in their name because we're instantiating them from the prefab, and they're all being parented to this game object here. And the reason for that is because we're eventually going to change the position of our invaders as a whole. And so instead of having to change the position of each one individually, all we'll have to do is change the position of the parent here. Okay, now let's actually do the math to set their positions. So we're going to need to know the position of the row, and then from the position of the row, we can offset that based on the column. So let's establish a variable here called row position. And I'm actually going to come back to this. I want to kind of just lay the outline of our code first, and then we'll actually assign a value to this. But after we instantiate our invader, we will set our position. So initially the position of our invader will be whatever the row position is. And then once we have our row position, we can offset that by whatever our column is. So the columns refer to the x-axis and the rows refer to the y-axis. So for our column here, we're going to change the x, say plus equals, and then basically we just need to say whatever column we're currently on, and then multiply that by some amount of spacing. So let's say there's 1 unit of spacing. So let's say each individual invader is 1 unit. And then let's say there's an extra unit of spacing or padding in between the invaders. So for a total of 2 spacing, we can hard code that value. Now we could actually turn this into a variable so we can change it in the editor. But just for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to hard code that. So column times spacing. And then finally, we can set our invaders transform position to be that position. Okay, now we need to do our row position here. This one's going to be a little bit more involved, but initially here, it's going to look the same. I mentioned earlier that the x or the columns refer to the x-axis and the rows refer to the y-axis. So the y here is the main thing we need to set. It's really the same thing. It's whatever row we're on times some amount of spacing once again. And so, what's the, we can say the size of each invader is 1 unit. And let's also say there's 1 unit of padding in this axis as well. So we'll just use 2 just like we did for that. And that's it, really. There will be more we need to do to this, but let's just see what this looks like for now. So there's our grid of invaders. They're all being animated. Looks good. Now notice how, as a whole, they are not centered correctly. So that's what we want to set our x-axis here for the row position. We kind of want to apply an offset so everything becomes centered. So let's say we have a variable here called centering. And our centering is basically we need to subtract half of the total size of our grid, right? So let's say the total size of our grid in the width would be our spacing 2 that we've specified times the total amount of columns minus 1. Just that columns minus 1. And then the same thing for the total height of our grid. It's whatever the spacing we specify, 2. And then the total amount of rows minus 1. So this gives us the total width and height of our grid. And then from here, our centering is just going to be subtracting half of that. Because the center point should be, the center, it's halfway from halfway from each edge of our grid. So that's why it's half. So new vector 3, or this can actually be a vector 2. It only needs 2 axes. So width, or once again, we're supposed to subtract, so it should be negative width divided by 2, and then negative height divided by 2. So that's our centering, and then we just need to simply apply that to our row position. So our x here becomes centering.x, and then our y will become centering.y plus the position of the actual row. So that logic still remains. And that should be it. Let's go ahead and test it out. Okay, there we go. So our grid looks centered perfectly within our screen now, and we can even be it. Let's go